So let's get started. It's really great to have Bruce and Melissa join me today for this conversation. I'm sure many of you know Bruce and Melissa's work. They both have been in the product sphere for a long time, and both work for Product Culture, who advise and assist people with their product teams and building amazing products. And of course, Bruce and Melissa have a fantastic book called Aligned out, which you should definitely go and read. Whenever I mention it to people recently, they've said, it's been a very helpful book in their careers. And I often talk to people about stakeholder management. It seems to be one of the hardest parts of the job, and not many people talk about it and discuss it. So I think the book is very, very timely. So great to have you both on this call.
Thanks, Tim. Really good to be here. And we're hearing the same thing echoed wherever we go and speak, that there hasn't been really anything addressing this hardest part of the job, this hidden side of the job that seems to make the most difference in whether you're actually successful or not. You have a strategy, right. You have priorities, you have OKRs, you have a discovery process, but none of it's any help if you haven't got your team aligned behind, well, why are we here in the first place?
Yeah, completely. And I think you can really get blindsided and knocked off course, even if you're very good at all of those things, as you say, if the kind of stakeholder stuff isn't lined up and in place. So I've got a sort of loose structure, and be good to just talk through a number of aspects. And what I really like about the book is it follows a central character as they start a role and meet personalities around the business. Many of those personalities, I'm sure some of us will have come across in different names, but in our various jobs. So I thought it'd be fun to start off with that initial thing when you first join a company, and how you sort of begin to orientate yourself. Because there's some very obvious things, but there's also some very subtle things that if you don't kind of pick up on, you can delay your sort of safe landing, or worst case scenario, really sort of cause problems for yourself. So I'd just like to hear from you both, how, some of the tips and ideas of how you sort of start to orientate yourself in a new company when you join.
Yeah. Well, as you said, it's sort of a story, and little known fact about it is that wasn't in the first version of the book first draft that we wrote. We got to pretty much the end of the book of the material we wanted to cover without that, and the feedback we got was it could use a consistent example to help us understand how to apply all of the techniques that we put into the book, and the story kind of grew from there. But the opening scene is something that maybe has happened to some of us before, where our hero product manager just joined the company, first group meeting with management, runs into a very difficult stakeholder who thinks they know exactly what should be done and doesn't know why it's taking so long, and can't we just, and I need you to change the entire roadmap right now based on my latest priorities, and pulls a power play on Irie immediately and says, "You'll do what I say because I say it." One of the lessons from that, in particular, that scene, is that this is one of those executives who's been around forever and has a kind of a vague title, and no one reports to them, but everyone listens to them. And so it's hard to, from a formal process standpoint, from an org chart point of view, from all of the sort of ways we think we know how to navigate the organization, you shouldn't listen to this person, and yet everyone does. And so the mapping out of the real power structure of your organization is the first most important thing that we recommend that people do in the book.
Okay. Yeah, I would also say when you're new in an organization or in a social group or anywhere, you have to sort of get to know the people you're going to be working with before you start to assert yourself. And a lot of people think they want to land right away, make an impact immediately, day one, right? Which is what Irie tries to do in the story. She tries to kind of save the day in her first meeting, and it doesn't exactly work out well. But getting to know not only who's on the org chart, right, but who are the power players, but also I after we wrote the book, my brother-in-law sent me this article about writing a WTF list when you first get there, right? It's like, these are the list of things you're like, what the F? Like, why are people doing it this way? But you write it down. You don't react in the moment because you don't know who made that thing that's you think is stupid, right? You don't want to call somebody out on it, not realizing they're the ones who built it. And there's also a lot of reasons why things are the way they are, whether or not they're good reasons, there are reasons. And thinking about, writing down a list of things and not trying to tackle them all immediately, but thinking about, okay, who are the people I'm working with? What is the history behind it? And sort of getting curious about why things are the way they are before jumping in and trying to change everything.
I think that's such a great point, because I think as product managers, often our instinct is to sort of try and get involved and help. But I also think sometimes, particularly when you come into a small organization, I think sometimes people look to the product manager and assume they're going to come in and kind of fix all this stuff and be really helpful. And so I think you're right. I think that idea, I love that idea of writing down a list. So you kind of get it out of your head, but you don't necessarily act on it straight away, because I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a superpower when you join an org in that you can spot all this stuff that perhaps everybody else stopped seeing a while ago. But at the same time, there's a real risk, isn't there, as you say, that you kind of just plow in and step on too many toes.
Yeah, you have to deliver the messages tactfully, right?
Yes.
When you see something, you can't just be like, "This is all stupid. We need to change it." It's like, well, that's interesting. How did that end up happening that way?
Yeah. And I know one of the other things you kind of talk about in the book is, there's the org chart, but the org chart might not necessarily actually reflect what's going on in reality, in that, there might be people who, seem to have the ear of the decision maker or are the decision maker, and you don't really realize that. What kind of tactics can people employ maybe in those first kind of 30, 60 days to try and understand like where the power lies and how to navigate these structures?
We actually have a tool in the book called the Stakeholder Canvas, which you can also download from our website, alignedthebook.com. And it's a way to kind of write down all the people you're meeting and to write down information about them that could be useful. And don't overlook people you think might not be significant, like the executive's administrative assistant, really, really important person in the company, right? So some people don't think about these certain roles as being influential, even though they are.
Yeah. There's a couple of other things I would add to that. One is you can observe what actually occurs. You can observe who has coffee with who, like knowing who regularly has coffee with the CEO, whether or not they are a direct report, whether or not they have a big team, or sit somewhere between you and that person on the org chart, can give you a clue as to what are the main things on the mind of the CEO and where the center of power in the culture sits. There are a bunch of those sort of context clues. In Game of Thrones, Syrio Forel, the fencing teacher for the Starks, says, "Look with your eyes." What he means is don't be fooled by appearances or what people say, but follow what's actually happening.
I think that's really useful. I think particularly, when you first join a company, it can be easy to accidentally align yourself with the wrong person, and you kind of arrive and think that this person is maybe, and it may be just that they're kind of helpful or whatever it is, and then later on you sort of find out that actually you need to be putting your efforts in elsewhere. So I think that's
another half of that actually is depending on the culture of the org and the personalities of the people involved. There can be bluster. There can be people who come in and say that they have authority and that you need to run things by them, but in fact they don't. In fact, they just claim it or wish they had it, and so are acting as though they have it. And I ran into that situation once in a quite large company I worked for, where the central pricing czar was not approving of my proposed price changes, didn't meet his criteria for success, but none of what he was arguing for made sense in my business. So eventually I escalated it to the head of my business division, who said, yeah, just ignore him.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, amazing. A lot of time and effort spent, and then you sort of find out that actually it's wasted time.
Right. So that's the second bit, is ask. Ask. You can't necessarily trust the answer you get directly from someone about their own authority, but you can ask around and you can get a sense.
Yeah. Great. Amazing. And we've talked a little bit about org structures, and org structures can have a big impact on product managers, and there are obviously structures that can be really useful for product, and structures that can be very counterproductive for product. It'd be great to just talk a little bit about that, and just understand a bit more about, if you find yourself in an organization with an unideal org structure. And I think a lot of product managers out there are working in, kind of project structured organizations that are maybe trying to transition, have got product managers in place. How can you do that? What's the way to kind of, manage your way through those challenges? You
sound like you have personal experience with that.
Don't we all? I think we've all got some personal experience with that.
Yeah. It's hard to change an entire organization as an individual contributor, especially, and as the new person. But I think there's always things that you can do locally as kind of a proof of concept to say, you know what, I'm going to do it the way everybody else is doing it. But in addition, I'm going to either make these tweaks to what I'm doing, or I'm going to try this new thing and see how it works. So, for example, if you're in a place where the roadmap looks more like a delivery plan with specific, features and things, you could try out that version, but also a version that has more thematic entries into your roadmap, and to try to run that by a few people, especially stakeholders, to say, hey, does this align with what you think we're trying to do here? And so you can sort of have those individual conversations to say, like, can we maybe try it this way? To get some feedback about how amenable people are going to be, and to get some people maybe on your side. If one of your stakeholders say, actually, yeah, that's a much better description, I like that better. Hey, I can actually show that one to customers because it talks more about their problems than about these individual features. Then you've got somebody on your side, and you can, have a little bit of a snowball effect, ideally.
Yeah. My ideal scenario, or the advice I usually give if you get a lot of pushback on that, if it's a very project-oriented organization, is to try to combine the virtues of both, is to try to give people what they demand. Here is the projected date for this thing, but at the same time, wrap that in the outcomes that are wanted, that are being looked for, is to say, well, the reason we're doing this is because we believe it will deliver this value to the customer. Here's how we're measuring that. And we'll deliver this value eventually to the organization. And here's how we're measuring that. And what that does is that tying those things together is it answers the why question that a good roadmap should answer for those who care. And it maybe even raises the consciousness of some people about the why, and helps them do a better job over time. As people get to expect to hear the why along with the what, you can shift the emphasis of the conversation. You can maybe even find yourself in a situation where you've done some advanced research and you've realized that in order to reach the why, we've got the wrong what, and make a case for changing course and saying, well, we've all agreed all along that the whole reason we're doing this is to increase retention, but we've put some prototypes in front of people and they're really not all that keen. But at the same time, they're saying they really need this other thing, and they're leaving us for competitors because of this other thing. So if we really want to increase in retention, we're going to change course. Yeah, great. I think those are both really great answers. I think, Melissa, your perspective of, I'm sure a lot of us have been a product manager in an organization and feeling like,
what can we do as individuals? And I think you're right, giving, it's a really great sort of practical example of how you can just sort of start to change, to change that approach. And I think, Bruce, as well, I think often a lot of the language that we use can start to have those changes as well. If we talk about outcomes rather than just talk about outputs, delivery times and deadlines, and actually, like you say, try and link them to commercial outcomes and customer outcomes. I think that's just start to get that language used with our sort of line managers and more senior folks, I think can be really helpful.
And I think there's something even one step beyond that, right? You talked about different language, right? Mm-hmm. Thinking about what your stakeholder, what their goals are, right? Yeah. And what kind of words they use and what their metrics are. And you can say like, hey, this thing that we're trying to do, this is going to help you achieve your goals. Mm-hmm. Because I've done some research and I understand what your goals are and I know how you're measured in your department. And I've talked to you enough that I know that this is what you're trying to achieve. So I'm going to sort of frame it in a way that's like, hey, if we do this thing, you're going to get what you need. It's not just all about me, the product manager. I'm trying to make sure everybody is successful.
This is getting toward what some people sometimes call politics, right? You feel like you're trading favors with people, or you're working behind the scenes. And I want to say this is a whole hidden side to getting a good outcome for whatever it is that you're working on, your product, your project, your initiative, your career, your own career. And there's nothing dirty about it. The organization is full of a bunch of human beings. We're all there for some overlapping, but some different reasons. And we all want a good outcome together. So finding out what somebody else's good outcome is just a way of making a connection and making common cause with that other person. It doesn't have to be a secret. It doesn't have to be nefarious. It doesn't have to be some backroom deal, but understanding, that the CMO's bonus depends on marketing qualified leads, means that it's much easier to understand when they make an argument that touches on that in some way, why they're doing that, and that you're not going to easily talk them out of something that helps them with marketing qualified leads.
Yeah, that's great. And I think kind of connecting that back to our earlier conversation around kind of onboarding yourself in that first 30, 60, 90 days, presumably that's something you can do as well, right? Is when you're speaking to these people is try and get a sense of what their metrics of success are and what's motivating them, I guess.
Yeah, we have something else in the book, stakeholder interviews, which is kind of just like customer interviews, where you want to get to know the person, right? And you have an easy excuse for it when you first start a job, right? To say like, hey, let's connect. But you also have an excuse if you've been there for 10 years, right? Yeah. To say like, hey, we haven't chatted in a while, let's talk about, I'm interested in seeing what's new in your world and what you're most focused on. And then you ask a bunch of questions and get curious and earnestly curious. And people like other people who are interested in them. It's just the way our brains work. And so it gets you some great information, and hopefully it gets you on somebody's good side to ask them about themselves.
This gets to a general principle of the book that we hit on over and over again. Many product people probably already have in some measure the skills they need to be good at stakeholder management because they learned how to deal with customers. And if you think of your stakeholders as a kind of customer whose motivations and personal and professional you need to understand in order to devise something that they're going to adopt, then everything kind of falls into place. Oh, I need to do my research. I need to interview some customers. I need to understand what success looks like to them and where they are struggling. If my thing can be seen as solving a problem for them, then they're going to buy in. Maybe not literally the way a customer does, but figuratively.
And you can do prototypes. You can do proof of concepts. You can think about a new process. You can try out a new meeting. You can run your roadmap by 15 different people and tweak it along the way, right? There's all sorts of things, all sorts of parallels.
Yeah, that's great. I love it. You can kind of product management everything, can't you? But I guess it's interesting how often we're so focused on kind of, just trying to do our job that we forget that actually a lot of these skills that we use, we can use in lots of other domains as well. I think that's great advice. And then just kind of so I mean, I'm sure all of our stakeholders are all the time very helpful and kind of sing from the same hymn sheet and give us very clear feedback and all the rest of it. In the book, there's a stakeholder called Sparks who just derails everything all the time, or seems to. I'm sure we've all had people who maybe aren't as extra, or hopefully aren't as extreme as Sparks, but where we've had to deal with difficult stakeholders, or even just stakeholders, that we struggle with, right? Often these things come down to just kind of personal things where, they operate in a different way to the way that we're used to. It'd be great, obviously, to hear some tips on dealing with difficult stakeholders. And as I say, stakeholders aren't always nefariously difficult. It might just be that, they have a different perspective that we don't understand. But yeah, I'd love to hear some of your tips on dealing with challenging stakeholders.
Well, first, you've hit on the character that everybody talks about. He's the one that everybody says is triggering for them of past painful experiences. And we set that up on purpose to put Irie in a difficult spot, because he's a founder, and he claims a lot of influence. So Irie does some of the things that we've talked about. She tries to understand by talking to her own boss, hey, is this guy for real? Do I have to take his input seriously? And unfortunately, the answer is yes, because that's just the political reality of the organization. Then she tries to engage with him and tries to do a stakeholder interview, but he keeps avoiding her because he's too busy. And so we give her one tool after another, and they all seem to work a bit and then not afterward. And so, you have to have some drama. What other tips have I not covered there, Melissa?
Well, we walk through a number of different tips to try to figure out, like, is it really them that's the problem? Is it you that's the problem? Does everybody else have a problem with them? Or is it just something personal? Thinking about setting goals for your relationship, saying like, hey, here's what I want to get out of it, like to try to plan a little more strategically, and to think about whether they're giving you a hard time because they just enjoy giving people a hard time, which is true sometimes. But a lot of times it's because they're just really passionate about the thing that you're working on. And they think that if they don't like say exactly what's supposed to happen, it's not going to go well and everything's going to fail. And so sometimes people are difficult because they're just really passionate about what you're working on. And so in those situations, trying to set role boundaries and things like that and build trust, obviously, right, are some things that you can do to try to get around that.
We give a few tips in the book about developing rapport and trust with your stakeholders, and it can be challenging if they're avoiding you, but we have a few guerrilla tactics. Irie, for example, in the book learns that Sparks really likes coffee and really likes really good coffee and complains about the quality of the coffee all the time. And we set things up so that she has access. She's Jamaican, and she has access to hard to get Jamaican high quality fresh coffee from family members. So she brings it into the office and sort of lets the aroma of the coffee do the talking.
Nice.
Now, you can't always get into the office with people today, right?
Yeah.
You can't always do my favorite thing, which is to camp out by the coffee machine with your laptop and wait for your stakeholder to come by.
Yeah.
But you can reach out over Slack or even WhatsApp and try to have an informal dialogue like you would over coffee, that gets around to the thing you need to talk about, that gets you to build a little bit of rapport and understanding of your common goals with the other person in a setting that isn't a meeting with an agenda that's on the calendar that you probably, if the person's really busy, can't get for a month anyway.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I mean, if you are kind of remote or hybrid, then trying to get time with stakeholders can become a formal thing, and then that's a very different conversation, like you say, to if you just trying to build a relationship and have a casual conversation. So I think that's great, coming up with ways of being able to do that kind of online, and obviously Slack and all the rest of it is a good way of doing that. So you can build those relationships and have conversations without the pressure of a formal meeting.
And
I think there's something to be said for meeting in person at least once.
Yeah.
And a lot of companies don't have those opportunities. Many do, right? Even if it's just a once a year thing where they bring everybody to the office or something, like try to take as much advantage of that as you can.
Yeah.
To meet up with somebody, or to, even just walk down the hall with them, because once you meet somebody in person, they become like a real person. And then that makes the online interactions so much easier down the road.
Yeah. That
Definitely.
Sounds great. Yeah, and I remember a situation I had with actually somebody who reported to me, and we used to have meetings. She was absolutely fantastic. Whenever we had a meeting and I proposed something new, she would always shoot it down, and I just couldn't figure out why this person was kind of doing this in these meetings. And I realized after a while that her personality type, she liked pre-warning. She liked to prep before meetings, whereas actually I quite like shooting from the hip. I'm quite happy with kind of fluid situations. And I found that actually, if I just had a conversation with her 10 minutes before the meeting, or even, send her some notes before the meeting, then she turned from a detractor to actually a supporter in the session, because she was able to process it before we actually had the meeting.
I had someone exactly like that in my career, and it took the previous product manager on the project with that team, that person saying, "Oh yeah, with this person, here's what you need to do," and previewing the ideas with them was the most important thing. This gets to how people think and how they process information and new ideas. There are people who the first thing that goes through their mind is everything that could go wrong with the idea. These people are great at QA. They're great at systems architecture. And we hire these people on purpose for these skills. Right? So let's not be surprised when they apply them in the moment. Let's give them a little bit of time to make their list of objections, and then think, well, okay, so most of these things are probably not actually going to happen, but I do want to talk about number 3.
Yeah, definitely.
I think those skills also overlap with management skills, right? Not all product managers are managers, but some are. And the same kind of skills that make a good manager is, figuring out who's on your team and what their individual styles are, and sort of adapting yourself to how they work, can be applied to stakeholders as well. Things like how they make decisions, right? You said how long they take to process things. I had somebody who worked for me once who said yes to everything because he was afraid to say no. And there was like a special technique that I developed to see whether or not he actually wanted to or was going to do something, which not everybody knew how to do. So I had to sort of be translator a little bit. But, when you get to know people, you start to like see those patterns and see when somebody says yes, but then next week is like, no, I never agreed to that.
Yeah. And I just actually, that picks up something. So Liz in the chat has just talked about how she really enjoyed the book, and obviously we were talking about Sparks, and she said how in the book, you give timelines and make it clear that there isn't like a quick fix to this stuff, and actually you'll have to try a few things, and some things will work, some things won't, but over time you'll start to make progress. And I guess part of that goes back to what you were saying about just thinking about having goals for the relationship. We don't necessarily have to be best friends, but there are certain levels that we need to get to in order for me to be able to execute my role and do a good job and be okay coming into work and all that sort of stuff.
Some of it is also self-defense.
Yeah.
You may find somebody as we've all experienced at some point, just really toxic to deal with. You just come away shaking with frustration or pent-up anger, and you just wish you'd never had to deal with this person anymore. And so sometimes you can arrange that in a sufficiently large organization. You can get transferred to somewhere, some other team where you don't have to deal with this person. But oftentimes you can't. And so setting some limits with this person, saying my goal is to have my one-on-one with them once a week, and then to set up systems such that everything else can be handled over text. Or as happens with our hero in the book, you can decide when what your red line is and what would ultimately cause you to quit.
Yeah.
If you recognize that you are no longer able to meet your goals for your job, not just the company's goals, but your personal goals, you're not learning, you're not seeing a way forward in your career, you're finding, you're having to do compensation every time you're off work just to calm down, then if you really can't do anything about that stakeholder, it may be time to move on.
Yeah, I love that. And I really like that about the book. And a couple of people have mentioned that to me as well, that you tackle the subject of quitting and thinking about that up front, which I think is great and really honest. I don't think a lot of kind of books do. A lot of these kind of particularly business books tend to entirely be based on everything going perfectly. So I think it's nice that you kind of touch that. And I think for product folks particularly, I think that's really helpful, and understanding what your walk away point is, I think is really helpful. I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping before we do. So people are putting some comments and questions up, which is great. We might have some time, hopefully, at the end for questions. So please do put them in the chat. For some reason, for me, it's only read only. So I was going to put something in the chat and say add questions, but I don't know why. But I'm not able to. I can type, but it won't send for some reason. It's a bit weird, given I'm the admin. But there we go. So if you are kind of listening along and you've got questions, please do put them in the chat. I can read them, and I will try and fold them into the conversation. Okay, so that's great. I wanted to move on to another topic that I'm sure product managers are all very familiar with, which is the urgent request. So you spent time putting together a roadmap. It's much better than the roadmap you did last month, and better than the one you did the month before that. And you're really, excited about this. And you've done all your stakeholder management. Hopefully, you've done some kind of shuttle diplomacy, and you've spoken to loads of people, and you've put your outcomes and your themes on there. And then something comes in left of center, and it keeps happening, and you're just never getting time on the kind of strategic roadmap. It'd be great to hear your thoughts on how you deal with that, and any kind of tips and tricks for handling these situations.
Does that happen to you? I mean, I've never heard of that scenario.
It might have happened once. It might have happened once, Bruce, but some time ago. I don't know.
You suppressed it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things. I want to talk about what to do if an emergency lands on your plate, and how to address that. But I think before that, you have to make sure that everybody's aligned on the goals, the why, the where you're heading, because you need to use that as a foundation for discussing this new idea. If you don't have that, then it's just, I forget who said, there's a quote like, if we're going on data, let's do that. If we're going on opinions, let's use mine. So, so it's like, if it's just a matter of opinions, like you're not going to win. Not that it's a winning game, but the idea is, if you've pre-aligned on what the goals are, what the priorities are, even how you determine priorities, what the process is to decide, to make decisions, then you can decide as a team what makes sense based on the goals.
Okay.
Right. And maybe the change is big enough that the goals have changed. right?
Yeah.
And like, let's have that conversation. But in the event that the goals haven't changed, it's just this new great idea, then you can talk about a few things, right? One is cost of delay. What happens if we don't do this right away, right? Like, is the world going to explode, or is it like, not that bad? Opportunity cost. What are we working on now that we'd have to stop in order to do this thing? And how important is that? And how do they sort of compare on the key metrics that we're trying to measure? Risks and mitigations. Let's say we did this thing, right? Or let's say we didn't. What are the risks in either scenario, and how can we mitigate it? And then dependencies, right? If you're in a big enough organization, the thing we're working on now, we need to do in order for these other people to do things. So this new idea, while it's great, is going to wreak havoc on like the whole system if we do it right away. So is this really the decision that we want? And taking stakeholders through your decision-making process and asking questions along the way, right? What is the cost of delay? Like, how important is this versus the other thing? Gets them to think the way you're thinking instead of just like, no.
Yeah, and that's a really important point there, is you could imagine a process that other departments have, in my experience, called a black hole, where people lob in suggestions. There's an official forum or suggestion box type of functionality, and then they either hear nothing, or at a certain point in time they hear no, but with a vague explanation, if any. Or they see the next version without getting an answer. They see the next version of the roadmap, and their thing is nowhere on it, and so they're like, none of these things are the way we want to do it. The way we describe in the book to bring your stakeholders along on these decisions is in a chapter called it derives from Melissa's original prototype chapter for this book, which was on how to say no. We advocate saying no together as a team. We advocate having your stakeholders in that process with you, evaluating all the requests with you, rather than you doing it on your laptop and your special spreadsheet that you keep to yourself. This is a group effort. It's a team effort. And you got to treat it that way from day one, even down to, as Melissa said, agreeing on what the criteria are before you actually try to make decisions.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I think it also, I think often product folks, maybe they get pushed into it, but they feel like they're in a reactionary posture rather than being in a proactive posture. And I think what you're talking about there, both of you are saying, really is you have to get out ahead of these things and involve stakeholders, help them get visibility. Because I guess, again, going back to that kind of empathy thing, a lot of stakeholders won't have the visibility that you have, or actually vice versa, you might not have the visibility they have. And so I think doing it as a team enables you to get some control, but also, or I don't mean control, I mean enables you to
a sense of control, though.
A
sense of that there is a process, and that you have an influence on it, and you're part of the conversation. It gives you that sense of control, and it gives your stakeholders that sense of control too, or at least agency.
And the more they see about how the process works, the more they start to trust the process, right? If it's a big black box, they'll be like, I don't trust the outputs. I don't know how you came up with that. Like, why should I believe that? But if you say, well, I considered this and this and this, and here's how I make the decision, and this is better for the goal because of X, then it's like, oh, okay, I can follow that logic. I get it.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And I think there's I suppose in the extreme example, nothing in the roadmap is getting done because it's constantly getting, terrorized. But I guess that's hopefully a fairly unique scenario. And then I suppose on the hopefully more normal scenario is there will always be things probably that come along that nobody in the business could have, And so I think there is some aspect of a PM being resilient and recognizing that change is probably going to happen at some point.
The competition makes a move, and you need to think about your response. The economic conditions of your customers and your buyers in particular change, and so they're starting to think about the value proposition and the cost differently.
Yeah.
Or you make an architectural change over time. You go, as many companies have been doing over the past 5 years, you go from an installed solution to a cloud solution. For example, lots of companies that we work with have both in the field at this time. So there's just a lot that changes. And it's important to train your organization that your roadmap and your statement of strategy and priorities and goals is constantly evolving, and that it isn't something that you work out with everybody in early January, publish, and then it doesn't change or get revisited until the following year. It's really something that you're constantly gaining new information from the world about, that should inform your strategy. And so the way to sort of message that to the world is to be regularly, maybe monthly, maybe quarterly, publishing a new and updated version.
Yeah.
And I knew this one guy who published a new version in a PDF every month with an explanation of the changes. We moved this up because it felt like the signal from the customers was that it was more important to them than other things, or we moved this back because it was proving more complicated than we expected. Those sorts of things. And then once a quarter, he would have an all hands meeting, and he would go over it along with everything that had been released during that quarter, go over the updated roadmap live, and invite questions and input.
That's fantastic.
There's a question in the chat about, working together with your stakeholders on the roadmap and how much you work together. So I'm going to go back to something we talked about a little earlier, which is thinking of stakeholders as customers, right? You can do collaborative design on your product with your customers, a customer advisory board or whatnot. They're not actually designing the product. They're just involved in the process. So if you think about your product as a roadmap and your customers as stakeholders, they're not actually putting together the roadmap, but they're involved along the way, right? So you come out with an initial version of the roadmap, a prototype, a proof of concept, a beta, whatever you want to call it, right? And that's the initial version of the product. You run it by a few people, you realize you forgot something, you realize that somebody had a misunderstanding about something, you tweak it, you put it back together, you review the changes, right? So it's not like you're in a room and you're like, so what do you want to put on the roadmap? It's more of an intentional process, just as you would get customer feedback on your product.
Yeah, that's great.
We have this chapter on workshopping in the book because it's a hugely valuable technique to getting to alignment. Also, as product people, it's a hugely valuable technique for getting valuable input into your roadmap that can make it better. That can, if you understand what sales knows about the customer and the buying process, if you understand and have the insight and the creative ideas of the marketing team on the segmentation and where the commonalities lie, or the packaging, if you understand what customer support is hearing every day from customers about things that are troubling them in using the product, those are all really important inputs to the roadmap. So rather than have them outside the process, let's have them inside the process. Let's actually get together and have a workshop like we would with a customer on okay, given our goals, what ideas do we have for the next most important things we should be considering for the product. Now, like Melissa said, that doesn't mean they are making the decision. We're not advocating that it's decision by committee or that you're giving away essentially your authority to everyone else as a product manager. We describe in the book a participative decision-making style that we have found particularly effective. And what that essentially means is that for any given type of decision, one person or one role in the organization is the owner of that decision. We call it the driver. And that is, their job is to ensure that a good decision is made, and they have the ultimate responsibility for making that decision. But with that responsibility comes the responsibility, also the obligation to seek input from key people who have a stake in the result, who can contribute to the result. So that's all the usual suspects. It's sales, it's marketing, it's finance, it's customer success. And you'd be silly not to get their inputs. You'd be stupid not to get their inputs. The effect of bringing them along on the journey and being the person who runs the workshop and makes the final decision, but gathers all the information in the process, means that you get a better answer. And because everybody was involved from day one, they feel like they are part author of the result too. So they're much more bought in than they would be if you presented them with the exact same roadmap after running a process behind closed doors.
Yeah, I think that's really great, Bruce. And I think again, just thinking about that kind of reactive, proactive, or kind of offense and defense thing is, often PMs ask how to say no because they're getting a whole load of ideas thrown at them from all over the business. And if they're not careful, they end up isolating themselves because they're just saying no to everything because they can't deal with the barrage of stuff. Whereas if you're proactive, like you say, and you create forums where people who have ideas because they're invested in the business and they're invested in the product can actually do those things in a way that can be managed and is curated and there's a process around it, then actually you handle that in a much more positive way. And like you say, you'd be crazy to turn a lot of these things down. Okay, you might not be able to take all the ideas forward, but you don't want to stop that flow, right? You don't want sales to stop talking to you because you just say no all the time and shut them down, or whoever else it might be.
Yeah, and they might actually hire their own engineer on the side and get something like that's happened. But going back to the first 30, 90 days question too, one of the things that I like to do at the beginning is have that barrage of stuff meeting with the stakeholders. I'm new here. Throw me everything. All the things you wish that it had, every feature, let's just put it all together. And then what I do with that is I do a little pattern matching right after the meeting. I say, oh, during the meeting, it's like, well, that's interesting. Why do we want this? What problem are we trying to solve? And try to get a little more. And if I need to follow up with people individually, I do that. And at the end, I try to consolidate all that into some themes, right? It looks like we're talking about problems with onboarding. It looks like we're talking about problems with this. Have I captured everything? Right? And for the most part, if you think about it thematically, you do capture everything because you don't have to get into all the details of every single request. You're like, we need to make the onboarding experience better. They're like, yes. And I have these 37 things that you guys have suggested about making the onboarding experience better. We're going to look into that with customers and we're going to figure out what the right way is.
Great. I love that idea. That's great.
I can't resist. I have to give a shout out to Kevin Seghetti, who put a comment in about spending time with customers. Two things on that. One, I think the same applies to your stakeholders. You should be talking to them frequently and often. It's not an end of the process kind of conversation. But second, Kevin was a high contributing member to our early readers club.
Nice.
For this book. Before we published it, we published to this group of people who read everything and gave us tons of comments in the Google Docs and came to our monthly Zoom and said, well, what I'm dealing with is this. And I wonder if there's room for that story in the book as well. So thank you to Kevin and 139 other people who joined him.
That's true. It's almost like you applied product management processes to writing your book, Bruce and Melissa. Did you? That's amazing. I love that.
Yeah. You can product management out anything, you said before.
I'm sure somebody was right about that, actually. I can't remember if it was Teresa Torres or somebody wrote about, because obviously when she was writing her book, I think she did a similar thing where she, released early and often and got feedback, which you can do, obviously, Google Docs and all the rest of it. I love that.
Ash Moria wrote Running Lean years ago, and he used that same method. He was teaching lean startup methods of testing and iteration, and the book is a description not only of the method, but on how he used it to write the book.
Amazing. It gets very meta if you're not too careful. Brilliant. Okay, folks, we have got a few minutes left. I want to ask Bruce and Melissa what they're up to in terms of product culture but do put any questions or comments on the chat while we've got a couple of minutes. So maybe let's do that first and see if anybody has any burning questions they want answered. Bruce and Melissa, I know, Bruce, you've just been doing a bit of a European tour to promote the book. Melissa, I'd love to hear what you're up to over 2025 and what we can look forward to.
Yeah, I've also been doing some book promotion stuff, working with Bruce at Product Culture, doing some other sort of coaching, resume reviews, various things on my side. But I'm looking forward to talking more about stakeholder management with folks. Some of the things that I've been experimenting with is at one of our book launch events. We had a woman come up to us at the end and she's like, I'm in sales and I really appreciate this book because I know what the product managers are thinking now. And I know why they keep saying no to stuff because it's hard. And I didn't realize that before. And so thinking about, who else we could reach with our messages, right? I think a lot of times for product managers, you end up preaching to the choir, right? And so how can we think about, UX folks, engineers, salespeople, marketing people? Is there a way of bringing this to their attention so that the product manager doesn't have to, do all of this process change on their own?
This actually brings me around to what we do with companies, with product teams all over the world. We help them set up the conditions for success for product. And some of those, as we describe in the book, are cultural. You can set up your teams for success by involving them in decision making, by bringing all the smart people into the room and workshopping it, by agreeing on objectives up front, by doing a good job with a stakeholder interview and getting to know people and how they think and what their motivations are, and by setting up decision processes that are across the company that are collaborative rather than either top down or bottom up. Some organizations are just like, the roadmap is the sum of the parts of all the individual teams' roadmaps, and it doesn't necessarily mean anything when you do that. The opposite is also dysfunctional in many cases. So you're looking for a deliberate approach to how do we make decisions. And so we work with executive teams on how to set things up for success for their product teams.
Terrific.
There's also, I know there's a couple of questions, but there's the idea that some people think that they have a process problem or a delivery problem, and really they have a people problem. And so it's interesting to come in and work with a client where they're like, we have a delivery problem. And you're like, talk to a bunch of people, you get curious, and it's like, well, actually you have a culture problem because people are afraid to tell you how long it's actually going to take because you don't like that answer and you reject it. So they tell you what you want to hear, and clearly it's not going to get delivered on time. And so it's like, you might have a psychological safety problem going in there, not a delivery problem. So having like an outsider come in and be able to view that and to see what people who are in it every day can't see.
Yeah, that's true. It reminds me of that old quote, the hardest thing about software is people. It's that kind of, similar thing. I'm just going to jump to some of the questions. So Liz asked a great question. Bruce and Melissa, how did you collaborate to write your book? 2 PMs, 1 product.
Right.
Well, I'm glad we're still friends. It is tricky, but what we tried to do, if you think about a portfolio product, right? The product gets so big that 1 PM can't do it. How do you divide it up? Making that sort of analogy. So we split up chapters to start with. He said, I'll take chapters 1, 3, 7, and 9, and you take whatever. And so we wrote drafts and then we exchanged them and we read each other's thing. And over time, it sort of came together and we created, some goals and some things that we wanted to try for consistency. And we just worked really closely together to make sure we were aligned the whole way. I don't know, Bruce, you want to say?
I echo everything that you said. And when I just add on to it that when editing each other's stuff, that was some of the hardest part of the work. There were a bunch of challenges there. One is you're taking a friend and collaborator and you're telling them you're wrong about a bunch of stuff. And it's not some, feedback you might want to consider. It's like, no, I disagree. Or no, this is not clear. And I don't want it to go out this way. Right. And that feedback is hard to hear and accept. And yet you got to get there.
Yeah. It sounds like obviously you're still friends, so it obviously all went very well. And it sounds like a very productive working relationship if you're able to have those conversations and still move forward. So I think that's all credit to you both.
The thing that broke the tie, of course, was the customer. We had the Early Readers Club, and there were times where Melissa would say to me, well, okay, yeah, but none of the early readers people said this, so.
Yeah, amazing. Good. Okay, I just want to quickly check. So Jitant just put a qualification to his earlier question about discussing challenges in the roadmap. Is it, collaborating with the wider team, whether you do that as part of putting changes to the roadmap or actually putting the map together. So he was talking about stakeholders whose input may not align with the business strategy. I think you were meaning, start the process and collaboration as early as possible when you were talking about this stuff, so that you
need to align on the business strategy before you can align on whether or not to do a thing. Because if they keep having input that doesn't align with the business strategy, they might not agree with the business strategy, and you need to take a step back.
Or it might be a large enough organization where they have just a very specific point of view, a narrow point of view on it. And the business strategy is to go into let's say, a new market where nobody knows you. And so it's going to be difficult at first to make progress. And yet their department's goals is to make as much revenue as possible, as quickly as possible. Well, those are irreconcilable. And so it's important to recognize that as early as possible. Bring it to the surface. It's not, no one's at fault. No one is a bad person. It's a fact of the situation. Now we can pragmatically deal with it.
Yeah, brilliant. Bruce, thank you so much. That has been a tremendous hour. I've really enjoyed talking with you both. It's flown past. Where can we see that? Are you speaking at any conferences in the next kind of few months? Is there anywhere we can see you at conferences? I think I've seen on your.
That's work in progress. Melissa, have you got anything coming up?
Not immediately. We're both doing a bunch of podcasts and things like this that you can follow us on LinkedIn and see what's coming up. And if you're interested more in the book, you can go to alignthebook.com. If you're interested in product culture, you can go to product culture.
And we have a weekly, what we call nano letter. It's so short, it's easier, it's faster to read it than to put it in your folder of things that you're meaning to read and never do. And it also will let you know where we're appearing next.
Amazing. I'm a subscriber, and I can validate all of that. It's a very good newsletter. Good. Thanks, folks. Really appreciate you joining me today, and we'll hopefully speak soon.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.
Everyone, bye-bye.